Be live, I think. Let me check. There we go. Yeah. Seb, what's up, brother?
Things are good. It's a nice early morning here. I think you're a few hours ahead.
Yeah, it's 11 a.m. for me. So
Wait, and so whereabouts are you based, John?
I've been keeping that to myself for now, but I'm in the I'm in Eastern time. So and I'm in South America, Caribbean area. So I had a nice run on the beach and a nice swim in the water this morning. So ready to go and have a good conversation about with you, and we'll see where that takes us. But for both my benefit and maybe people listening, any background that you're open to sharing, that would be great to get this conversation started.
Oh, for sure. So long story short, my background is I'm a mountain bike instructor. I've been a professional mountain bike instructor for most of my life. And I would say I've always had a fascination with distilling these complex biomechanical ideas down into their simplest form and then trying to teach that. And I've loved mountain bike instructing, but I struggled with the fact that it's just you're helping an individual. And I think that I've always wanted to help more than an individual and try and do a bigger part for humanity, as altruistic as that sounds and as audacious as that sounds. And I think that where that took me is I've always found an interest in finance and kind of how the world works and trying to piece together this puzzle. And I've been interested in options and futures and the markets for 10 to 15 years now. And that led me down a path of, well, there's something wrong. And there's what is wrong in our society right now that is causing wealth inequality when we're meant to be seeing prosperity? Why are we seeing like polarization? Why are we seeing all of this stuff kind of come to a head? And that kind of gets you to dig into money. And then that's what led me to Bitcoin. I suddenly realized, you know what, when you start to understand these bigger issues that we're facing in the economy right now, then you start to realize, hey, this is where that piece Bitcoin that originally I thought was a Ponzi, this is where that fits in. And so a few years ago, I kind of discovered Bitcoin, went deep down the rabbit hole. And then 2 years ago, quit my job. And I've just been focused on Bitcoin since then. And I just started a platform a little while back with Greg Foss and a few others. And we write educational content for the wage earner and just try to distill down these complex subjects and macro and Bitcoin fundamentals and really distill them down for the average person, because they're the ones that need it most. And if we want to have a good go at trying to help the world kind of push forward into prosperity, then I think we've really got to allow the average wage earner access to this kind of information.
Totally. And so that's called Looking Glass EDU, right? How did that come together with Foss and the other contributors or partners?
For sure. So that came together basically, I would say after the pandemic, I went deep down the Bitcoin rabbit hole. And that's when I was like, man, how can I contribute? And I decided to start writing. And writing has definitely never been, to be 100% honest, it's never been my forte. And when I was about 12, I dropped out of English in school. And 14, I left school because I was just like, this isn't for me. Like, what's for me is following these things that drive me and the things that get me into my flow state. And to me, that was mountain biking. And so at the start of the pandemic, kind of going back into writing was really interesting. And Grammarly, I would not be here if it wasn't for Grammarly Pro. I think that's done a lot of my editing. But yeah, I started writing. Greg read one of my pieces and I was humbled at the time, and he reshared it. And Greg's very much like a magnet. He very much like connects a lot of people. So he introduced me to another guy called Daz B, and another guy called Jason, and then and one more, Max, who kind of works for Saifedean. And together we kind of sat down quite a few times over the last year and kind of put together, how can we educate and make an impact? And that's very much where we came with the idea, you know what, we want to target the wage earner and try and steer, backstepping, I recognize that we're such an amazing community and we've got so many people of like-minded individuals that want to help and want to give back. But we're limited in terms of our resources as a community, as a Bitcoin community. And so therefore, it's really important to be able to make sure that we're not just having too much overlapping and just kind of like wasting our resources, or at least having a lot of redundancy in the system. And so I think that's where we've got some amazing content by Gigi and Michael Saylor and Breedlove when we want to talk about more of the philosophical side of things, the deeper stuff. And then we also have like the Sharma guys when it comes to kids' books or kids' engagement. And that's where we recognize there's not a ton that speaks to actually the people that need it most, the people, the kind of the jargon-free, concise, clean content for the average wage earner. And so that's where we wanted to try and really focus our energy on kind of that crowd. And I believe we've targeted it pretty well, and we're pumped to see it. And it's we're so blown away with the response. And yeah.
That's awesome. And so 2 questions. Is it all free content? And the second one is, how do you target that group of people or that demographic? Like, by what means do you not only in like the subject matter and the style of the content, but how do you actually get it to those people?
100%. So those are great questions. And, I would say when it comes to our actual content style, when we initially went into this, we didn't really know what to expect. So we ended up creating a self-paced online course that basically goes through our macro scene. And the reason why we focused on macro rather than Bitcoin to start, it mentions Bitcoin in there, is that we recognize that Bitcoin is a point of contention for a lot of people, and it brings up a lot of emotional charge. And so because Bitcoin brings up a lot of this emotional charge, when you try and mention it at a barbecue or mention it to your friend or mention it to those people that actually need it most, we recognize that if you can actually teach people about our monetary system and a lot of the issues and the byproducts around our monetary system, and at the same time kind of introduce, okay, well, what is money? Is money the store of battery? Is it a store of time and energy? Like, why do we need money in an economy? When you start to talk about this kind of stuff and you go through the evolution of money from barter to commodities to like precious metals, metal-backed paper, all of these kind of things, when you start going through the evolution of money, what is money? What are the issues we're facing around money? Then people can start to recognize, okay, we do have an issue. And a lot of the times that goes back to scarcity and centralization. And that's where Bitcoin really starts to be that kind of orange light on the hillside. And I think that's kind of how we approach the actual course structure. And that's our self-paced course. But from there, we've just been blown away because since releasing this course about 3 months ago around the Bitcoin conference, we've just had an absolute influx of people reaching out and just being like, you know what, I'm a teacher. I want this in the hands of schools. I want to be able to teach my students this. And so we've been converting the course right now into curriculum content because we realize the importance of needing to get this education into the hands of those that actually don't know we have an issue and don't know the questions to ask. Because there's going to be many people that, okay, yeah, I've dug down the rabbit hole a little bit, or I have an understanding of finance and I realize there's an issue. How can we create a solution for this? And they're going to start searching for things. And that's where they're going to come across these self-paced courses. But if you can get into the schooling system and you can start shaping people's minds as they're going through their educational journey, and you can start to teach them the importance of sound money, that's where we can really start to make a difference, I think, for the next generation of individuals that are going to kind of lead this world. Because I think that our central banks and our governments have, I would argue, have been quite fiscally irresponsible over the last quite a while. And so if we can kind of plant the seed and talk about sound money and start to introduce Bitcoin and the benefits of Bitcoin, I think that's immense. I think it's absolutely immense. And so we're working on turning our macro course into a school curriculum at the moment, a 21 course school curriculum that can be taught and cut down. It's very malleable. We're then working on a secondary course, which is a Bitcoin fundamentals course. It goes into, well, how does Bitcoin actually work? All of its fundamentals, it's the miners, the cryptography behind it, those kind of things. And then it goes into the FUD side of things and breaks down, well, why may the news, when it's hammering Bitcoin about energy or price volatility, or that it has no intrinsic value, why might those arguments not necessarily be very factual or accurate? And then the final course that we're going to tie all of this together is a financial literacy course, because we recognize that if we're trying to target the wage earner and we're trying to target these countries that need it most, which are at many times the developing countries, then if these guys understand, okay, the importance of Bitcoin, and now they understand the macroeconomy and the issues we're facing, well, now they need to have the skills to be able to understand the importance of saving, compound interest, trying to treat yourself as a bit of a business, and making sure that your incomings exceed your outgoings, and that you're able to focus on, say, passive income and things like that, so that we can help to kind of increase prosperity.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And so I didn't catch, maybe I missed it, but is this all freely available? These are, some of them are paid and some of them are free.
Yeah. So I should have highlighted that. So yeah, I would just say, like, we aren't a non-profit. we're definitely a for-profit, but the reason why we focused on the for-profit is because any income or revenue that we can get just allows us to drive that back into the product, which allows us to ensure that we can create an even more beneficial product. And so at the moment, our goal is to make sure that all of our content is free to the end user. And we're going to look at ways of potentially monetizing through other means. And that can be, whether that's through advertisement, whether that's through some of these apps for sharing streaming sats, things like that. We're going to figure out ways that we can monetize that doesn't impact the educational journey of the end user. Because although a lot of us in the Bitcoin community are capitalists at heart, we also recognize this kind of paradox where it's just like, well, if we want to educate people about Bitcoin, if we're monetizing this, then the countries that need it most, all of these developing nations, they're pushed out. There's a barrier for them. And so we would just want to make sure that high quality education is available to these individuals that need it most.
Yeah, makes sense. Did you see, it was only it might've been this week, or maybe it was last week. A group of people, I know the IBEX guys are involved. I don't know who was fully behind it, but down in El Salvador, they developed this curriculum to be integrated into the public schools. And I think this was the first pilot. And if it goes well, they're going to roll it out to more. And the final exam was bringing down a bunch of Bitcoin people from all over the world to one-on-one test the students. And part of the test was recovering a wallet and loading a wallet and sending funds and all this kind of backing up, your seed and all this stuff. And it was so cool, to see this take place and that this was part of the education. And, education has been something I've always been super critical of and, super passionate about. And I always love to think about, in fact, I keep a running note of all the different potential curriculums in the future that would be cool to see integrated into a young person's initial education. And you just think about our education. We came out, most of us came out, even if you went to a private or unconventional school. I mean, that's a bit different, of course, but most of us came out of an industrial educational system, right? Very similar curriculum, not very much divergence, very kind of narrow focus on a lot of things, not very applicable to, or a lot of irrelevant education, not customized for different preferences and different proclivities and different, natural talents and that kind of stuff. And I just can't wait to see in a Bitcoin world. I think there's going to be a lot more customization. There's also going to be a broader spectrum of educations available to people, and it's going to be a much better fit between someone's natural talents and proclivities and their ambitions and the education that they're able to access. And if we're at all, I mean, you and I probably are nothing special, but at least we're not completely regarded, at least we came out and we're somewhat well-adjusted individuals in this crazy world that we're in. I can't wait to if you give people on a Bitcoin standard, you give these people not only that, social and cultural stability, and not only that familial and financial stability that I think is fostered through a Bitcoin standard, but also an education that is far more robust. I mean, it's really exciting to think of what type of people that will produce and what they'll go on to do in the world.
Absolutely 100%. And I think that's where people don't recognize that a lot of our genius in the world comes from people that the genius itself, I believe that we have a genius inside of every single one of us. It's just rather than that genius being born, a lot of the time that genius is crushed. And I think based on our environmental circumstances or whatever that may be. And so I think that a lot of the genius ends up kind of succeeding and seeing its way through into these bigger corporations or making a difference in life, they've had those resources that have allowed them to get to where they are, with the exception of a handful of people. But I think that there are so many people in a lot of these developing countries that just don't have those resources and don't even know, because they're not given the education, they don't know how to expand the mind in a way that they can truly make a difference. And so exactly as you say, I think once you start to give people these opportunities, I think it's going to be unfathomable the amount of innovation, technology, and support we're going to see amongst kind of the global community. But it brings up a really interesting point, which is, I think what you mentioned about kind of the schooling, when you start to, a lot of the schooling that we have is very irrelevant. This is kind of a slight pivot, but along the same tangent. Jordan Peterson in a podcast a while back talked about kind of religion and the church, and the church from what is the benefit of the church? And he was regardless of whether or not you are religious and you believe in God, there is a benefit to the church, which is the fact that church is it's a community endeavor where people come together, and for one day a week, they forget about themselves and they start to think bigger than them. They start to think about this bigger thing that is going on. And what I think is so fascinating about Bitcoin, tying Bitcoin into this, is that before I went down the rabbit hole of Bitcoin, of course, I've loved teaching, but still my world was very insular. And I think that what Bitcoin does, and I'm sure I can probably speak to a lot of people in the space, is Bitcoin suddenly gets you out of yourself and starts to get you thinking about, man, how can Bitcoin impact our community? How can Bitcoin impact global humanity? What can Bitcoin do in order to kind of create a more prosperous economy? And so I think it's mind-blowing, because similar to the church, but not in a religious sense, I want to kind of detract from that religious sense. What it does is it kind of brings together that community and starts to get people thinking bigger than themselves.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think part of the reason why the church has that power is because people are coming together under the umbrella of at least a perceived higher value or principle. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what's happening with Bitcoin as well. It's kind of, and we'll probably discuss this, but it's a very similar thing, just happening in a different form, or perhaps modified for a different era. But I do, to your point, think it's a very similar phenomenon that's happening, and it's great. And some people see that as a negative, and some people see that as an extreme positive. And I'm definitely in the latter category. And I think the fiat era, in hindsight, I think will be seen as a very egotistical era. I think, fiat fosters that sort of worldview, in addition to, the whole perhaps decline of organized religion, and maybe we're in like a kind of interregnum where, people go back to a completely ego-dominated worldview, and there's nothing sufficiently valuable or no ideal that causes people to your point, to see outside themselves, or to see beyond themselves, and to humble themselves too, in certain respects. And this, I think, in addition to the fiat era, and possibly there's a causal relationship there as well, has exacerbated this thing. And I think Bitcoin might actually be bringing us back down, or at least causing us to reconsider what we've thrown away in terms of dismissing the religious institutions. And I think we're probably in the process of recapitulating a lot of that, and seeing what has been rightfully, thrown away. And maybe that's somewhat dramatic language, or, done away with in whatever capacity, and what is deserving of being brought back and reassessed and reintegrated again.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, 100%. And you know what? It's really fascinating. There's a book that I've heard a few people dismiss now, and it only kind of ignited that desire to read it. And that was Debt, the First 5,000 Years. And it's by a guy called David Graeber. And in it, he talks about how pre-money, there was something called the human economy. Post-money, we now have what's called the commercial economy. But what I think is really fascinating is, so to kind of break that down, the human economy was pre-money, and it basically meant that exchange was done on a moral and like an honor basis. Like, we gave back to the community, and we supported the community because it was in our best interest to do so, because obviously it meant, one, survival for us, but it also meant survival and prosperity for the community. And so exchange was more based on, okay, well, I'm going to give my part back to the community, because in the end, it all comes full circle. Now, when it comes to the commercial economy, we have, what money's done is created kind of the master and the slave. You've always kind of got the kind of, how would I describe it? Like, you've always kind of got, in every single exchange, you are trying to get what's best for you out of the exchange. Like, whether it's the monetary side, you want to try and get as much money as possible out of the exchange. Whether it is the goods side of things, you want to try and get the maximum service or goods out of the exchange. And so what that's done is it's created an interesting dynamic where people talk about, okay, the property rights. Well, property rights is really interesting, because what happens if someone owes you money, then in a sense that can lead to slavery and things like that. And so we're actually pushing aside the human side of things, kind of the soul, the psyche of us, and we're looking at us purely as a commodity that kind of can be traded. And so when it comes to the commercial economy, what's really fascinating is, because suddenly everything became a contractual obligation, and it removed the honor side of things and the morality side of things, humanity, I think, has trended in a slightly different direction than it was heading. Obviously, this is pre-money. Now, what I think is fascinating about Bitcoin is, Bitcoin, in a sense, brings us back to that human economy with the advantage that we also have money. Because I think as Bitcoin, if we were to, let's just say like hypothetically, adopt Bitcoin as a global reserve asset or a global reserve currency, if that was the case, then everyone would have access to this decentralized deflationary money of sorts, that over time, because there's a fixed supply, as productivity increases, as our deflationary world meant that goods and services kind of came down in price, it would mean that our purchasing power would increase. So if our purchasing power is increasing, that means that people can slowly over time work less, which gives them more time to spend time with their family and their loved ones and do the things they enjoy, which means they can start to give back to the economy again and give back to the community, because now it's not just about them. They have those resources to be able to give back. And I think what the fiat system does, unfortunately, through inflation, is it steals that from us. We're always just trying to look after ourselves because our money is worth less one day to the next. And so I think it's fascinating when you think about the economy inside in terms of how can we get people back to their roots of actually wanting to create that community and wanting to give back. And I think Bitcoin on a very high level starts to do that. It starts to remove the monetary function. Even though it is money, it kind of removes the monetary function from things because it gets us back to our roots.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I don't know if it removes the monetary function, but it certainly introduces a different kind of monetary function there, and I explore in Money Messiah and some other writing I've been doing recently, like the relationship between how consciousness functions and how markets and money functions, and the corollaries or the similarities between the two, even the kind of the latter being an extension of the former. And if that's the case, I mean, you look at what is your consciousness like, and what are you like when your head is all, there's so much noise in your head and you're not focused and you have a lot of anxiety. Like what kind of behavior does that elicit? And it elicits very, broadly speaking, destructive or counterproductive behavior, because when you're anxious, you're not calm, you're not thinking clearly, you're probably not making yourself available to others for either emotional support or, productivity of various kinds or anything. And you're kind of a mess. And I think the same is true in markets when they're predicated on a money that has so much misinformation and distortion in the signals that it's sending around. And as the imbalances that one person who's in charge of that money or who can control the creation of that money, the imbalance is created by that type of architecture, i.e., money being stolen from the masses and going to a select few. It puts people in that state of anxiety, that state of deprivation, that state of confusion and noise. And as a result, the behavior reflects that the behavior associated with that is very counterproductive, is very destructive in various ways. Alternatively, when you have a money with pristine signals, when your consciousness is very clear, when you're calm, when you're focused, when you're properly organized, when your value system, the hierarchy of your values is properly coherent with the rest of the world and the market and other people, and perhaps even higher ideals and values, like we alluded to earlier, well, what happens then? Well, usually you have a healthy, productive, integrated individual who's available emotionally and in other ways to members of their family, members of their community, etc. And I think that's what we'll see with a money that similarly has clarity imbued in its signal, right? Or is able to resist the distortion that might be introduced into its signal. And you get a market full of people that are more available, that are, more that have less anxiety, that have less deprivation, and as a result are more available both to themselves to consider some of these broader and bigger questions about who they are and what life is and how to orient oneself properly, and be made more available to their family and their communities as well. So I totally agree with that, and I think we're probably going to see that under a Bitcoin standard.
No, and you know what, I think it's always tough on a podcast because when you're trying to articulate, it's easy to kind of put in the wrong words. And when I say remove the monetary side of things, more what I was meant to say is it redirects our focus to something different, which actually may be of more benefit to the community. So rather than focusing on survival, we're now focusing on something that is bigger than us. So like, how can we help humanity? And you know what, like there was a fascinating Joe Rogan talk the other day, and I completely blanked on the guy who was talking. He was basically an astrophysicist, and he was talking about the cosmos. And in it, he quotes Carl Sagan, and he says, "The cosmos is within us. We are made of star stuff. We are a way for the universe to know itself." And what I thought was really fascinating about this is that if you think about it, well, when he says we are a way for the universe to know ourselves, in other words, what he's saying is like consciousness, our consciousness is a way for the universe to experience itself as we are part of consciousness. But then if we dig down a little deeper, like what is consciousness? Well, consciousness is a mechanism of survival. It's allowing us to choose our path in order to maximize our probability of survival. And now if we want to maximize our probability of survival, just as what you've just highlighted, well, then Bitcoin is a way to maximize the accuracy of the data that we're being given, as it gives us clarity through supply and demand, because we're not distorting it through monetary manipulation and all this kind of stuff. So I feel like Bitcoin, in a sense, is kind of a tool that gives clarity to maximize the human experience in uninterrupted data.
Yeah, totally agree with that too. And I think it could be the case that there's more to consciousness than survival. I mean, is our seeming affinity for meaning simply a means of improving our chances of survival, or is there some other reason why we have that capacity? I mean, who knows? I'm kind of inclined to think there is some other reason beyond survival. But to your point, I do think Bitcoin, by virtue of the fidelity of the signals that it represents, allows us to, to use Peterson's language, pass through the chaos of reality more efficiently. And by doing that, it means we're needing to give up less of our resources, less of our scarce resources, in order to transform the chaos into good and useful and meaningful order. And I mean, that seems very blatant and clear in terms of how Bitcoin will function as a superior form of economic coordination and value signaling between, members of a contiguous market, let's say. And that's very exciting too, because again, I mean, to me, it increasingly rather, all this stuff tracks back to meaning and value, because it's one thing to have a market function more efficiently, and that's great. And that's a form of progress, but efficiently in relation to what is it we're striving towards ultimately? It's not just a cooler TV. It's not just a better iPhone. It's not just a cooler rocket ship. At least I don't think that's, I don't think it should be that. I mean, for some people, perhaps that is the definition of progress, but I think consciousness, as you say, is more mysterious than that. And our presence here is more meaningful than that. And the big question is like, well, what is it? What are we striving toward? And I think it is the case that the things that we ultimately end up elevating in the interpersonal space that is markets and culture are the things that get us closer to those domains of greater meaning and value. And the enterprise of religion has probably served that purpose for a long time, although it seems very clear that something has gone awry in that domain. I don't think it's just because so many religious institutions have become corrupted or have proven themselves to be fallible. I think that's part of it, but I think there's something deeper as well. There's this ongoing evolution of the enterprise of determining what is the thing of greatest meaning and how we can align or cohere with that optimally, all the way back to like 100,000 plus years ago, where the first like human figurines, the first quote unquote art that human, hominids had developed, were these therianthropic, most likely spiritual, sorts of representation. And then time goes by and we become more capable at representing the contents of our mind, and we get more sophisticated representations of these things of greatest meaning. And it seems to me that we're in, again, perhaps interregnum is not the right word, but it seems somewhat fitting here, where we're in this space where our prior representations that potentially served us better than anything else we could have conceived of, because at the end of the day, why did they persist, have fallen somewhat, are now lacking. Maybe they've fallen behind some sort of progress that we've made, and things have to be updated once again. Our representations of things of greatest meaning has to be updated once again to reflect the circumstance of both our internal landscape and the external landscape that is culture and technology and symbolism and ideas and all the rest of it. And, you know, what I often talk about now is it seems like Bitcoin is a part of that process. And here we are trying to determine, you know, precisely in what way.
I think that's really, really well said. And I think that it's really interesting because I think it's bringing us back to ourselves in a way that I think what technology has done, technology, do not get me wrong, technology has been so beneficial to humanity and has brought so many incredible things. But at the same time, I think technology is a tool for distraction. And I think because it's a tool for distraction, it has taken us away from that sitting down and contemplating, just going and wandering through the forest and thinking about these bigger questions, just as you talk about. And in a sense, what technology has done, technology in collaboration with kind of the human mind, is we've now got spirituality and kind of intuition. And then we have, on the other side, we've got science and technology. And they, in our society, we've kind of built them as polar opposites, when in reality, they can definitely collaborate together and are one with one another. And I think we've kind of got to get away from this idea that it's either spirituality or it is technology and science. And they're two different things, because I think in the end, there's so much more to life than just growth and trying to help move humanity forward on a technological standpoint. And I think we've got to tap into that intuition of these things that are bigger than us, because I think we should be able to, I think that if we listen to what our minds are telling us and what the information signals that we're getting outside of traditional technology, I think it's fascinating. And I think there's a lot of like relevant data there that can help us.
Totally agree. And I want to ask you a bit more about progress, but yeah, I'll share with you, you know, an anecdote about myself first, because I think, you know, I obviously think a lot about like, what is the function of technology and what is the role of technological progress? And you know, in this era, and again, you know, it's so hard to think outside your own era. I mean, we are very much products of the culture that we came up in. And even though I would say, broadly speaking, Bitcoiners try to decondition themselves from, you know, the less desirable aspects of culture that might have been imbued in them as they develop, it's still impossible to do that completely, nor entirely desirable, right? It's hard to find the sweet spot where you want enough, you know, cultural understanding to maneuver and understand and move through the culture, but also not to be so wrapped up in the culture that you're not able to think concepts that are beyond it and that are not, you know, maybe properly or fully or even at all integrated into it. And so this is a constant dance of being like, you know, what do I want to let go of, and what do I want to, you know, keep inviting in and refine my understanding of. And so it's hard to determine, like, we clearly have it seems to me we clearly have a very material orientation in the modern era, you know, and by that I mean to what we've been discussing, we index less and less, you know, the meaningful, value, principle, spiritual oriented aspect of things, at least on a cultural basis, not to say that there aren't tons of individuals that have that orientation. And it's more and more focused on the material. So like, you know, building things and innovating and, you know, starships and going to Mars and all that kind of stuff. And I don't have any particular issues with any of that. But the issue perhaps is as you were just saying, the exclusion of one or the other in either of those camps, right? Rather than the harmonious integration of the best of both. And I think both suffer from doing that, right? An over-indexing of the material suffers from the why of what you're pursuing. You know, like, what is truly the meaning of just enhancing your material wealth or technological capacity? And in the former, it's like, yeah, it's great to be, you know, the Godhead, but when you come down back to earth, what does your immediate environment look like? And how much is it facilitating more of you pursuing that which you believe is most meaningful? And of course, everyone has to answer that for themselves. I mean, if you want to be a monk and meditate, you know, 12 hours a day, then that's your prerogative. But, you know, I think about the anecdote I was going to share is like, one of my primary objectives is to think clearly, right? if you're at all seeking for answers to questions that you don't currently have the answers to, then, you know, a clarity of thought seems to be one of the preconditions for improving your odds of understanding things. And then it becomes like, okay, well, what helps you generate mental clarity? It's like, well, a good sleep does, a good workout in the morning, time in nature, sunlight, feet in the sand, body in the water, good food, all of that stuff, you know, contributes to it. But then you can say, well, what perverts that? Well, if I get, you know, if I'm trying to write something and I'm in like kind of a flow state, well, what detracts from that? Well, hunger can at some point, right? It's like, you know, you're going along, you're writing, and then you get hungry. You're like, your focus shifts from whatever clarity you were operating within to, I really want that steak that's in the fridge, you know? And so it seems like, and I'm making a somewhat convoluted point about technology here, where it's like technology helps us access conveniences that otherwise would pull us away from perhaps what is most meaningful. So in this silly example, I just use that to say, if I can anticipate the degree to which my hunger is going to pull me away from clarity, then I can eat on a certain schedule, or I can have the food ready. So as soon as I get the inkling, I eat it and I come back to clarity, right? And so technology certainly allows you the convenience of being able to anticipate and satisfy things that might pull you away from clarity, whether it's deprivation, you don't have the comfortable place to eat, sleep, live, what have you. You don't have the material needs of life. You don't have, clothing, whatever. Like, technology allows you to meet those needs and then push them to the edges once again. And so the kind of question is like, where's the balance between rightfully making sure we can push things to the edge so that we can generate as much clarity as possible versus perhaps convincing ourselves or deluding ourselves into thinking that the push to the means by which we push things to the edge is the ultimate goal. Like more pushing to the edge rather than actually the fruits of pushing to the edge, which is a clarity that allows us to orient ourselves, or at least pursue things that are of greater meaning, but currently not fully understood.
Well, it's interesting because I think, there? Yeah, no, 100%. And what's really fascinating, that's kind of piecing the dots together, is money to bringing humans back to their kind of thinking bigger than themselves is kind of like technology to your intuition and your flow state. So like money, when used in its rawest form, as in something like Bitcoin that is fixed in supply, allows us to get accurate data signals that help us benefit us as humanity. But it's the same with technology. Technology, when used in its like cleanest form, allows us to be more productive and more efficient. But technology at the same time can be overused, which then ends up muddying our capacity to listen to ourselves and get into that flow state. And so I think that what's really interesting is, so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. I personally have not done ayahuasca. I have a ton of friends that have done ayahuasca, and I've also read a lot of books like Untethered Soul. There's like the Gene Keys, and what are the other ones? There's a handful of them that the writers and the authors say that when they got into their flow state, the information was not coming from them. The information was more of a download of this thing that is bigger than us. Now, what I think is really fascinating is it depends, like everyone can be on a different kind of end of the football pitch and say, okay, well, I don't believe in spirituality. That's impossible. But the reality is that a lot of these people, they get into these flow states and they're just like, I didn't know this information before, and I'm just writing this information is coming out. And I think what's really fascinating is that all of us, to some extent, like when you go to sleep, you could say, well, it could be your subconscious processing, but sometimes you'll wake up with the answers to questions you had before you went to sleep, and you don't know where the answer came from. And you haven't been thinking about it. Your mind has just been doing this background talk. Whether that is subconscious or whether that is something that's bigger than us, I think everyone would agree that by spending more time with ourselves and getting in touch with our intuition and getting in touch with listening to ourselves and what our body needs, a lot of the time we can start to get answers to these things that are bugging us, or these things that are bigger than us, or get answers to information that I think is fascinating. And sometimes when I read pieces by, say, Gigi or some of the other kind of philosophical breedlove, you're just like, how do they come to these ideas? Like it's mind blowing when they piece together these very abstract concepts to create this fluid narrative. It's incredible.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's a very interesting and potentially unanswerable question, like where do any thoughts come from? And I don't think we don't have many good answers to that. I mean, even when you're speaking, as in a conversation like this now, I mean, you're not reading off a script. You don't know exactly what you're going to say. You have an impulse to start speaking. You start speaking, and the words come out, and they kind of make sense, and they cohere with the words that the other person said. And how does that process take place? And of course, the idea of revelation, for example, is very common throughout religious and theological traditions and writing and stuff like that. And what is that but the same process taking place, but perhaps what it elicits, or what the output is seemingly more true than your average output. It seemed, and then for that reason, because it seems so profoundly true, or because it helps so many other things fit into place, you call it revelation. You say that it was from a higher power because it helps make so much sense of the world. It helps increase the congruence with your perspective and the world, the map and the territory, as it were. And it's super, super interesting. And I think for whatever reason, Bitcoin and a pursuit of understanding it is bringing a lot of people back to those sorts of considerations about, like, why that might be happening and what is happening there. And this is why so many people report that, going down the Bitcoin rabbit hole is such a fulfilling intellectual journey, is because it reignites all of this stuff. It makes it relevant and interesting once again. And, obviously I'm in the same boat, and it's amazing. But back to the question I wanted to ask you, and I think you've partially touched on it, but how do you define progress? I mean, what does progress mean to you?
Well, you know what, this is such a tough question.
You can do that individually and culturally, socially, if you like.
So the first thing that I would answer is, it's such a tough question because it's kind of like morals. Like, I think as an individual, we should always be seeking to, like, we should be seeking as an individual truth, and we should be seeking to what we believe is morally right. Because the problem is, we don't know that, like, there may be what is morally, from a community standpoint, what is right, or from a civilization standpoint, what is right. But in general, I think we should be seeking as an individual what we believe is morally right. Now, I understand that by saying that, you're also going to get people like Hitler, who in his mind, I don't believe people are inherently malicious. I believe people in their own mind believe what they're doing is beneficial to society in some way. And so although I very much disapprove and do not agree with what went down through World War II, I also see that Hitler, in his mind, was believing he was ridding the world of some form of evil, and he was doing what was good. So I think there's always this this confliction internally, where it's just like, I believe we should be seeking what is morally right, but that also means you're going to get people that may not be going down the path at which the common man or the community generally agree is right. So I think in terms of, like, what is progress, I think that it is a sense of, as a community, kind of coming to this common goal of what you think is morally right, and seeking truth, and not necessarily kind of sticking your head in the sand and saying, we'll set these targets, such as the Fed's target of 2% inflation and maximum employment, and we're just going to stick at it and keep kind of hammering the nail home. I think that if I was in their form of position, I think, and it's broad and it's hard to articulate, but I think that progress, in a sense, is, I would be focusing more on the humanitarian side of things, more on poverty and more on happiness and more of these abstract concepts. But then at the same time, and it's definitely a little bit of a ramble and I'm not really answering your question, but at the same time, in a sense, I don't necessarily want to set a target, because what happens when you set a target is the fact that you end up attempting to achieve this target in whatever means necessary. And that means that you usually end up down paths that maybe are not so beneficial, because in the end you believe that, well, we're trying to achieve this target, and so in the end the target is all that matters. And I think that's what we're seeing right now. We're trying to achieve inflation rate of 2%, and we're trying to achieve maximum employment. Is this necessary when we have an economy that's about to go into recession, and we have robotics and AI taking over a lot of jobs, and people struggling? Like, do we need to target maximum employment? Do we need to target 2% inflation? It doesn't make sense in this environment. And that's where I think sometimes setting setting kind of like project goals, targets is great. But at the same time, it can also be distracting of this bigger cause of, if you believe in the free market, you believe that through the ebb and flow of supply and demand, we will slowly trend towards this like inevitable direction. And I think this is then gets into the, well, do we have free will? Do we have free will? Do we have like choice? Is there fate? Is there like those kind of things? But it's such a hard question to answer, and I definitely did not answer your question very effectively.
Well, I mean, it's a challenging question, of course, but I mean, to your initial point about Hitler, and the question is like, well, you know, I agree with you. Most people don't consider themselves evil; they think they're doing good by the world. But as the saying goes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. But this is why I think the central enterprise of humanity for our entire history has been the question of what is right, what moral alignment, what moral compass should we be using, and that has been the enterprise of theology and philosophy and, you know, all those things, and mythology and that kind of stuff. Because as you say, I mean, it's too much of a slippery slope just to rely on yourself and say, well, I think I'm being good by doing this, and then you wind up killing millions of people and causing all this pain and suffering in the world. It's also why I think what I think these efforts throughout the millennia have elicited is that the pursuit, or the metric by which you judge progress, should not be an outcome. It should be a mode of being, and accepting that a certain mode of being along certain values or principles elicits the optimal outcome, even if you may not think that it is the optimal outcome in the time, or if you can't see how it is in its entirety. So for example, like, I think a lot of these pursuits over the ages have come to the conclusion that by, you know, and perhaps it's not fully understood, but something like, you know, speaking truth, and something like acting as though every individual is a divine being, deserving and worthy of sovereignty and freedom, and perhaps the all-resolving or all-encompassing force that is the notion of love. Like, these things seem to have been, perhaps, you know, at great effort, distilled down as these are some of the principles that we should primarily orient ourselves by, so that they elicit action that is the optimal action that we can take. Now, again, maybe sometimes we can't connect all the dots and see how that's all going to play out, but it seems to be the best option when the alternative is, well, I'm just going to dream up a conception of what I think the future should be and what I think a good future will be for as many people as possible. And then I'm just going to roll the clock forward and move towards that. And oops, it actually wasn't, you know, as good as I thought it would be, or I failed to consider these different, these different components of this, or I didn't make all the necessary considerations, and I made a mistake. Whereas rather, if you're acting from a place of these principles that have been elicited over time as being, you know, eternal or fundamental, then it seems to me that you give yourself the best chance of not making those massively, you know, those huge mistakes. And the interesting thing about that I often bring up, and that I, you know, have been wrestling with myself in writing and thinking and that kind of stuff, is if that is the case, and again, I do think it is, although that, you know, as I've just articulated, there's far too overly simplified. What does that say about the reality that we exist in? You know, if like an orientation towards truth, freedom, and love, let's say, and again, it may take some explaining to fully flesh those out, but if that does elicit the best possible outcome, both as an individual and as individuals interacting with others in a society or a culture, does that not say something about something deeper, some deeper coherence with whatever orders and structures the reality that at least we experience with our type of consciousness? I think it necessarily does, because the reason why it works better than any other approach is because it is cohering with something out in the world that we engage with. And this is why I think in narrative language and mythological language, that's why that structure of reality is called something like God, and that God is said to either prefer or be imbued with those principles, because it is kind of, and judges you based on that, because it is the territory that you're attempting to map and become as congruent as possible with, and those are the means by which you do so. And so I think our task, to answer my own question a bit, is to continuously attempt to gain greater clarity on that territory. And the degree to which we do that, that is the highest form of progress, in my opinion. Does that mean more technological development? Almost certainly, because that increases our capacity for representation and for understanding and for clarity of mind. And those are the things that elicit greater progress on that, on mapping that territory. So I think there is definitely a role for technology, but perhaps we've over-indexed it at this point in our civilizational, story. And perhaps under a Bitcoin standard, where these things become more clear and there's more balance brought to, markets and fairness and all this stuff, maybe we'll see a shift, and we'll dial down a little bit the just rampant push for technological innovation, and it'll be more intentionally channeled toward this emerging understanding of what progress is and why it's so important.
Well, and you know what? First off, I just want to say that you basically just distilled down what I was attempting to in my ramblings. That was absolutely phenomenal. I think that focus on, rather than a specific defined goal, I think is so much more important if we focus on values, and values of not truth, because truth can be subjective at times, but truth seeking, as in we're always trying to attain what we believe is true. And the problem is that it's always changing. And I think what's really fascinating with religion is most religions, or when I say most, I'll say a lot of religions, talk about compassion. And I think what's fascinating about compassion is it's telling you that people make mistakes and people may be wrong, but as long as they're kind of pursuing this idea of truth or truth seeking, then we can have compassion for their mistakes. And I think it's like looking back, let's just say, for instance, your great grandfather is racist or was racist. The thing is, we can blame him from today's ideals of where we do not support racism, we do not support X, Y, Z. But the reality is that when he was growing up, that was a normal endeavor. And so it is unfair for us to critique him by today's values. And so I think we have to have compassion for the environment that he was brought up in. And I think today, what our world lacks is a lot of compassion, because we're judging everyone under our ideals, and we're judging the past through the lens of the future. And I think that it's a fallacy, because we didn't have that information back then.
100%, and again, we go back to, religious wisdom. It's let he who has not sinned cast the first stone. And I think if we exclusively restrict ourselves to learning from or emulating people that are perfect, then we won't ever learn from anyone. And we need to learn from, there's an opportunity to learn from everybody. And if we just close the door on that because nobody is perfect and therefore nobody is worthy of emulation, or at least no aspect of their character or behavior is worthy of emulation or admiration, then again, we stunt our development hugely. Whereas if we can separate different aspects of people's character, realize that nobody is perfect, and then really appreciate the elements of them that are highly refined and exceptional and worthy of emulation and admiration, and forgive or have compassion for the aspects that aren't, well, then we get the double whammy of both refining our own capacity for compassion, but also getting the best out of these people. The founding fathers is a common one these days, right? Because, some of them were slave owners, and that's deplorable, and therefore they're all canceled. But, and like you, I mean, I obviously don't agree with slavery in any capacity, but back then, the moral, what confronted you morally in that time around that issue was very different than what confronts us today. And not excusing it, but we have to try to empathize with the time, like to my comment earlier, like it's very hard to step out of your own culture, but also your own time, extremely difficult. But this is a shame, because a lot of those people, I recently read Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. I'm reading the Federalist Papers now. I just watched Ken Burns' 9-part Civil War documentary, phenomenal. Like, some of these guys were so incredibly, well, they're just exceptionally impressive individuals on certain domains, right? And they were so noble and honest and attempting to do good in so many different ways. And much of that is worthy of greater understanding and inquiry. Like, I want to study those things so I can try to invite them into my own life and integrate them into the person that I am, because they're very rare qualities. And you don't see them represented very much in the world today, at least not to the degree that they were represented in those people in that time. But if I excluded them from any form of, ability to learn as a result of their faults, then none of that would be available to me, So, of course, I'm preaching to the choir here. I know everyone thinks that the current, cancel culture mob today, where anyone who's imperfect gets dismissed, is bullshit and is peak fiat and all the rest of it. But there really is so much amazing stuff to learn from the people that came before us, and in so many different domains. And we really should not be and religion falls perfectly into this category, right? Because it's so easy to dismiss religion in the current era, and it's such a facile dismissal. It's like, of course, there's no white bearded man in the sky, you fucking moron. Like, move on, next question. And it's like, really? Like, that's the amount of you're going to ascribe that degree of sophistication to the 5,000 years of people that came before you? Like, that's where they got, and they stopped there, and they were just like, okay, that's what I believe. And have you ever consulted any of the writings of any of these people in any of these eras? Because if you did, you would understand that their level of thinking was way more sophisticated than that, and likely way more sophisticated than yours. So maybe you should humble yourself a little bit before you go, canceling all these people in favor of your own moral and intellectual superiority. And again, this is part of, I think, one of the results of dismissing religion outright. Because, again, in a few minutes ago, in reference to Hitler, you said, well, what's the moral authority? Like, how are people supposed to be? What are they supposed to follow? And again, for all of its faults, I think the reason why all of this mythological and religious narrative, in the past 5,000 years, has usually elicited a central figure or a collection of figures to not only show, like, quote unquote, what is the structure of reality? Like, what is God's will, let's say, but what does it look like in human form in terms of behavior? Because that's what allows you to have a framework of a moral dimension to life, is like a reference point for saying, okay, like, unless I'm going to just devolve into complete moral relativism all the time, and we've seen how well that works, maybe I need a moral reference point in my life to see how well I'm doing in regards to how good I can do. And maybe those distillations in the form of mythological and religious heroes throughout time, and I'm speaking of figures like Jesus Christ and others, of course, maybe that's not the best like we can do, but so and I think 5,000 years from now, we'll probably have different representations of these ideas. And again, I think that's the progress of religious representation generally. So we should expect that. And again, what I think is currently happening with Bitcoin in a certain regard. But punchline is it was probably the best we could do at the time. And it probably, and it probably served a very positive function, even considering its faults. Just like those men, the founding fathers of the US served a very positive function despite their faults. And, welcome to history. Welcome to humanity.
Absolutely 100%. And I think that's the thing, is we got to have compassion for what has come before us. And we can try and fault something that was kind of, whether it was created in an ideal in someone's head or whether it truly is something that's bigger than us. We're trying to fault something that's 2,000 years old, 3,000, 4,000 years old. Like, we're in a very different time to the time that we are now. And I think that what's really fascinating with kind of what you're talking about is we tend to think of evolution in the physical form, like our body is slowly through evolution. We're becoming stronger. We're becoming more adaptable. We're able to take on the environment. But morality, in a sense, is evolving through what we're just talking about. If morality was a fixed thing where we're born into this world and we're given a rule book and this is morality that was set by God, well, I think we're going to see byproducts of that. Whereas I think, because who's to say this morality is right? Whereas I think what's interesting when you have this open-ended answer of morality, it's not a common thing. It's not a common goal. It's not written in stone. Is that morality changes throughout time, and morality evolves because we can take from our forefathers, we can take the information at which we found admirable and that we found helped progress humanity. We can take that and push aside the stuff that was not so beneficial. And I think in the end, we slowly trend in this upward path. And of course, we have ups and downs, and we go through periods where maybe we adopt traits that at the time we believed were in our best interest, which may prove to be not so much. But in the long run, I think that we trend in this upward path. And it kind of goes back to, you brought up an interesting point, which is, I think where some of the flaws in society that we're seeing right now is we're seeing this whole cancel culture or this disinformation campaign. Now, I read this the other day, and obviously everyone's completely entitled to their own thoughts on what's going on during the pandemic. But we're seeing, say, like, we're seeing the World Health Organization, and we're seeing the FTA come out, and they're saying this is what is right. But then if you actually look back at their data, 50% of all drugs that are released to the market end up being recalled. So you're saying we're taking our advice from someone who is wrong 50% of the time. So how, who's to say that their truth is right? And I think that comes back to, and I'm not necessarily faulting them, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but I'm just saying, if someone is wrong 50% of the time, why should we be taking advice from this person as to what we can and can't say? And I think that a lot of the time, technology and advancement comes from the fringe, because central powers end up kind of, I think, ideas and peer acceptance ends up causing central powers to kind of stagnate and ossify over time. And that's where we usually, throughout history, we see major advancements always come from the fringe as opposed from these central bodies.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think it's also the case, the reason why that happens, as you say, why there's such a willingness to concede authority to these institutions that have been proven wrong and or corrupt time and time and time and time and time again, is because as a result of this decline of religion, there's an authority vacuum. I definitely think that's part of it, because people, let's say religious people, they have a paramount highest authority, and anyone that presumes to be a higher authority than that and dictate their behavior more than that is dismissed, or at least heavily scrutinized or criticized, because there is no greater authority than, whatever your particular faith dictates. And, again, that position may be worthy of certain criticisms, but I think one of the problems that it helps alleviate or prohibit to a certain degree, prohibit's the wrong word, but is that you don't, maybe it's the case that we're always going to, let me put it this way. I think we all have a hierarchy. Our consciousness functions hierarchically. And for every different concept, for values, for, every action we take is an action among many potential actions. And there's a reason why we take that action. And that reason usually coheres to some hierarchy, conscious or subconscious, that's operating within us. And authority, and as we've been discussing, moral authority is no different, I don't think. And if there's no paramount authority, if there's no default paramount authority for dictating a lot of your behavior, then I think it's pretty logical to suggest that you're far more susceptible to other authorities stepping in, claiming they're an authority, you being primed or having a willingness or a desire for an authority because, hey, the world is uncertain and chaotic, and you only know, a tiny slice about your particular domain and your particular experiences. So you can't be expected to know about everything all the time. And you still have to act in the world, and you have to interact with other people in the world. So you've got to defer to presumed authorities on a variety of subjects from time to time. And so, okay, you say you're the authority, you look very authoritarian, and everything, the symbols and the stature and the power and all this kind of stuff. Okay, you must be the authority. And absent a higher authority to keep that authority in check, maybe I believe in that authority, or I conform to that authority way more than I otherwise would, and way more than I ought to. Mm-hmm. And I think that is a part of what's happening in the world today, is that we have an authority vacuum, and all of these false authorities, or at least, extremely fallible authorities, and oftentimes corrupt authorities, filling that void and leading many, many people astray.
Mm-hmm. No, I couldn't agree more. And you know what, like, one of the reasons why I wanted to jump on this call and talk to you is kind of very much along the lines of, you mentioned this and you talked about this in the Money Messiah, but it's just, I would love to hear your story about kind of Money Messiah and how it came to be, or like what spurred on the insight to write Money Messiah.
I mean, a lot of what we've been discussing, all of these considerations have become a lot more relevant or salient as a result of Bitcoin. Part of the story that I often tell when I tell my backstory is, like, I'd always been interested in these subjects and very curious generally, but they didn't seem to have that much relevance or real world application. And once I came to what I thought was a fairly decent understanding of how the world worked, I was kind of dejected. I was like, oh man, this looks really fucked up. I'm not liking the picture here, and I don't really see a way that you can turn it around. And when I began to have a better understanding of Bitcoin, or at least what I think Bitcoin is and represents, and the implications of it, that began to change. I began to think, like, oh no, all this can actually be turned around. And then it invites the question, like, well, in what direction? Sure, you can change things, if you can change things, how ought they to be changed? And that invites a lot of of the biggest, most profound questions. And I quote Jordan Peterson a lot in the piece, because listening to him, and in particular, more so than listening to him, reading his book Maps of Meaning, opened up a new angle, or a new method of understanding the theological enterprise, let's say, or the religious enterprise. And he may be wrong, and my understanding of it may be wrong, but it seems right to me currently, and I'll update it when that's no longer the case. And then as we try to understand what Bitcoin is, and again, what it represents and its meaning, and then I look around, and I've always been interested in the human aspect of this phenomenon and the cultural aspect. And I see how, I hear all these stories about how it's changing people so profoundly, like, how people, not dissimilar to myself, although in most cases, like, even more extreme, because I was never like, I went off course for a bit, and I probably partied too much. I didn't take care of myself as much, but I was never like super depressed and suicidal and like deep into substance abuse and that kind of stuff. But many people have reached out to me to say that that's where they were at for a similar reason. They felt alienated and disconnected and despairing about the world and the fate of the world and their role in it. And understanding Bitcoin has reversed that dramatically, to the point where now they see how the world could be so much better than it is now. And that hope has instilled and reinvigorated in them a sense of purpose and a reason to get up in the morning, and a reason to try to refine themselves, and a reason to try to bring the best of themselves forward. And so, the confluence of all those things just makes it even more of a burning question in my mind. Like, what is going on here? Like, why is it having this effect? Why does it seem to be so relevant in so many of these different domains? And Money Messiah was just my attempt to answer that question. And I never intended to write that type of a piece. I've told this story before, but like I intended to write in like January of 2021, I started the paper or the article saying Bitcoiners are not toxic, or toxic maximalism is not bad, or something like that. And it turned into basically suggesting that, like, Bitcoin is the second coming of Christ in a certain way of understanding it, so it was by no means intentional. But as I pursued trying to clarify these thoughts and meaning and all this stuff in my mind, and with whatever material I had to work with, Peterson's work, a bunch of other philosophical and theological stuff that I'd read over the years and read recently, with observing the cultural phenomenon that's happening in Bitcoin, with observing and hearing all these personal stories, that's what got spit out. And to your point earlier about like engaging the muse, or just, where do these thoughts come from? You're referring to Rob and Gigi. Like, I think they would probably both admit it as well. Like, you do what you can to prime the machine, and then you try to clarify, like, as we were saying before, get the detritus and the noise out of the way and see what comes through. And that was the case with Money Messiah. And, some of the topics that we've been discussing here today about the evolution of our representation of the things of highest meaning, and the function of the ideal in our way of acting, and the structure of our value hierarchies, and how that determines our behavior, and the ways in which we can refine those, and how we should be refining them, and what it means that if we refine them in a certain way, we actually get a better outcome. Mm-hmm. And what it means that we now have our capacity to represent ideas, to externalize the contents of our mind, has exploded as a result of the emergence of the digital world and digital landscapes. What does all that mean for the biggest questions that we've always been wrestling with since time immemorial? And so, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of the genesis of the piece.
No, and I think it's fascinating. And I think you've really spoken to, I was reading some of the comments at the bottom of the piece, and I think you've really ignited a fire in a lot of people, because I think a lot of people have this. There are some people that are always going to, it's kind of like the innovative curve. You're going to get the first early adopters, and it's not necessarily through adoption, but more of you could liken it to, how would I explain it? So think about, like, obviously we've got the adoption curve. Now you've always got kind of that middle few of those early adopters that are going to step out of their way and go and think bigger than themselves and try and pull together these pieces of information. And I think that piece is one of those pieces where I've read many, as with many others, have read many pieces about Bitcoin, how Bitcoin functions and all this kind of stuff. But the weird thing is when you start going down the rabbit hole of Bitcoin, you start asking these bigger questions. And I think that piece is very much one of those pieces that had a pivotal change, and it created a pivotal change inside of me, where you really start to, man, he's pulling together a lot of these threads that I myself have been thinking about, but I haven't been able to conceptualize them or articulate them. And I think that the energy that you put into that piece is phenomenal, and it very much comes through in the writing. And I think what's really funny, and everyone can take from this what they will in their own beliefs and apply it to the story I'm about to say. But long story short, I always find like the spirituality aspect of things really fascinating. And a while back, I decided, I was like, you know what? I'm going to go see a psychic, because I think it's always interesting to see what they have to say. And I've never seen a psychic before, and I've heard such amazing stories. And you're just like, man, you want internally to believe that it's real. You want there to be this thing that's bigger than us, and we're striving for this bigger ideal. And so I went and saw this psychic, and the psychic knew nothing about me, because I got her number from a recommendation from a friend, and I texted this person. So all they knew was my name was Seb and my mobile number. And if you type in online, nothing comes up. So I know they know nothing about me. And midway through, she just interrupted me and was just like, and at the time, I hadn't explained what I do. I hadn't explained who I am, like my values, what I'm trying to do. And midway through the conversation, she just interrupts, and she was like, I'm getting a message. You're in a group with 5 or 6 other people, and you're writing content for the you're writing content to help educate. Now, what's really interesting is right now there are two energy forces colliding globally right now, and what you were doing is what I visualize. She's trying to articulate. She's like, what I visualize from this kind of message is that you're fighting this, and I don't want to say good because I'm not trying to say good or evil, but I'm just going to use the term good as a placeholder. But you're fighting this good fight of good energy where you're trying to educate and help inspire people to like take control and empower themselves. And this is it's not an overnight thing. This isn't going to happen quickly. This is going to be a long, slow process. And as long as you keep writing, you're going to be downloading this information, this larger body of information to be able to help move humanity forwards. And people can take of that what they will. But what's really fascinating is I spoke to a friend, and my friend, he works in the industry as well. And he went and saw a psychic the week before. I had no idea. And I started to mention this to him. He was just like, I just spoke to a psychic and they said the exact same thing. And I was just like, what? And I think what's really fascinating is everyone can take what they will from that. But I think that what I think is amazing from the Bitcoin community is that I've never been involved in a community that are taking the bigger picture and they truly want to do something that is bigger than themselves. They're not in it for themselves a lot of the time. Like, yes, there's a lot of people that are in it for the money, but there's a lot of people such as yourself, such as a lot of the writers, Gigi, these kind of people that are writing purely because they want to do something better for humanity and they see a better ideal than the world that we're currently living in. And they're creating a system at which we can opt in for. And I think that is where I think Bitcoin in the long run is hopefully going to succeed, purely because I've never seen a collaboration on such a large level before. And just to give kind of like one short little story, like the other week I spoke to a guy in Nigeria, and this guy's such a nice guy, and he reached out to Looking Glass because he wanted education for his community. And at the end of the conversation, we had a really good conversation, and at the end of the conversation he was just like, you know what, like he lives in a rural community, like pretty poverty-stricken community in Nigeria. And he's just like, I've never seen whites and blacks come together for something that is bigger than them ever in my lifetime. And this is bigger than us. This is more important than us. And I think it's true. Like this, I think as long as we are seeking truth and we're trying to have compassion for what has come before us, I think that we can come together with this knowledge base that we have and create a better world and a more prosperous world where we can spend more time with our friends and more time with our family and more time with those that we care about for the betterment of society and community.
Amen, brother. Extremely well said. I couldn't agree more. And, to tack on to the end of that, because time with your friends and your family or community are things that you value and find meaningful. So I would just say, more capacity and ability to pursue that which we value and find meaningful, whatever that ends up being. And I want to know what that is, because I don't think the book is ever closed on that as an individual and as a culture. We can always bring more joy into our life. We can always experience, the joy that exists in the moment, let's say, to be a little bit woo-woo, but like there seems to be always more ground we can gain on that. And I think it's, while being appreciative and grateful for the ground that the territory that we've mapped already. But I totally agree, man. I think it's amazing. And, what you said makes me think of a few things. First of all, on the psychic stuff, I'm torn on this stuff because on the one hand, I'm a big believer that pretty much anything is possible, right? I mean, it's almost like, how could we even conceive of something that's not possible in this, as you said at the beginning, we're just made up of stardust that's coalesced in a certain way for some reason. How could it conjure up something that's not possible with the same stardust, in that sort of a way? So I kind of believe everything is possible. It's just a matter of time and capability and technology and who the hell knows. But at the same time, like I've always been a huge skeptic of all that kind of stuff, because like I feel like when it's actually put to any like legitimate test of the real skill, it like, the equivalent of like a double-blind placebo-controlled study, let's say, would it stand up to that type of scrutiny? And who knows what the answer to that question is? But I will say this, it does seem to be the case that spooky stuff is happening around Bitcoin. Now, maybe, I completely concede that might be me just wanting to have this be more mysterious and meaningful than it really is. And I'm imposing this, like, most likely that's the case. But, I've heard stories, lots of them, of very kind of serendipitous, synchronous, spooky sorts of things happening as a result of basically aligning with or having your, consciousness upgraded via whatever it is that Bitcoin represents. And so who the hell knows what's going on there? There's certainly still lots to be determined in that domain,
Well, and you know what? I think it's one of those things, and this is where I wanted to kind of preface the story with, like, people can take from it what they will, because I believe that in the end, our experience is how we interpret this world. And it's kind of like the map is not the territory. Like, we do not see reality as it is, because we are interpreting reality through our own emotions and through our own experiences. And so in saying that, I think that when you hear, like, whether there's legitimacy or not, like, I'll give the analogy of, let's have a look. I'll give the analogy of, I don't know, a lucky pair of socks. If I wear my lucky pair of socks and then I go out and I meet a girl and have an amazing date, and I attribute it to the lucky pair of socks, is there any harm in having this lucky pair of socks? Like, in my mind, I've just, man, this is amazing. I've got an amazing life. I've just met this amazing woman. I've had an amazing date because of my lucky pair of socks. It doesn't matter that there's no correlation or causation. In the end, it's just helping me feel more fulfilled in life. And so I think, as Nassim Taleb says, he's like, take superstitions, take the positive ones that benefit your life and disregard all the negative ones. And that way you benefit from both sides. You benefit from any superstition or any higher ideal in the positive way, and you disregard all the negative stuff.
Yeah, fair enough. The more important point I was going to mention about what you said is, first of all, I think, as is so often the case with anything that presumes to, that has this type of effect on people, I think ego is the enemy, right? Unless you are willing to kind of humble yourself to either the greater cause or the greater truth or something greater, then you probably won't be able to access, at least not in its fullness, whatever the phenomenon is. And there's a lot of examples of that in Bitcoin, some very recent, I think. But it's so interesting what you said about the guy in Nigeria, because it's so often the case with me too, that you meet someone that you've never met. Maybe you haven't even interacted with them, but you can kind of be like, and of course, this is, part of the reason why people call Bitcoin a cult and they use it as a pejorative, but it's like, you can go up to you meet somebody that you never met, like just walking on the beach, and Bitcoin comes up and like, you Bitcoiner? And they're like, oh, I'm a Bitcoiner. It's like, oh shit. And like, you already know, you already have there's a strong probability that you line up on a lot of the most important values, or at least you've both elevated certain values to such a high prominence that, like everything becomes smooth, because on the stuff that really matters, you're probably very close. And on all the other differences, I mean, this is actually kind of the point. Then your differences can be celebrated rather than be a point of friction, because, if you line up on what's most important, truth, freedom, sovereignty, love, whatever it is, then all your differences are just interesting. It's like, oh, wow, like you think that because you grew up there and you look like this and you have a preference for that. It becomes stimulating rather than dividing. And again, I mean, this is part of the reason why we have to attempt to look at Bitcoin in light of such phenomena, right? And why it kind of speaks to these deeper levels of meaning, because it is only those deeper levels of meaning and that affect people in such a way, and that create that sort of dynamic between people that have never met. Mm-hmm. And I agree, it's incredible. And if you're the word humble keeps coming back to me so often in Bitcoin, not only because Matt's stay humble, stack sats is just the best meme of all time and the best saying of all time. But as is the case with so many things, the proper orientation seems to be humbling yourself to a greater truth. And to the degree to which you're able to do that, more becomes available to you, like more opens up to you, more opportunity, more joy, more connections. That seems to be like the trick, and maybe the the game is to humble, increasingly make sure that you're humbling yourself to the best thing to humble oneself to, and again, we wind up in religious territory with these sorts of ideas, because that's the whole point, like in religious narrative, it's, humble yourself to God, give yourself up completely to God, and he will fill your life with joy and love and that kind of stuff. I mean, that sort of language is replete in those, in religious texts and doctrine and that kind of stuff. And again, I think there's a reason for that. Again, the specifics of any particular story, you may have an aversion to, or may not be the one that's propagated in your culture, but the mechanics of those stories seem very valid and seem to have been developed over millennia of attempting to figure out what the mechanics of value and meaning and morality are. And this is one of the benefits that reading maps of meaning, one of the benefits I derive from reading maps of meaning is being able to see through the superficial layer on top of these mechanics and be able to see the mechanics behind these stories and narratives and wisdom throughout many different traditions, and then be in a better position to not only compare them, but to then take those mechanics, superimpose them onto Bitcoin and be like, it seems to be a very similar thing happening in terms of its mechanics, but maybe in an even higher fidelity or more pristine or more applicable, more broadly applicable, less culturally tainted or determined form. That's interesting. What does that mean? And we're still figuring it out.
100%. And you know what? Like, one of the biggest things that I've taken away from the whole maps of meaning thing is that a while back, I went deep down the rabbit hole of like communication, how we communicate as individuals. And it's really fascinating when you're communicating with individuals, because communication is very much a maps of meaning as well. Like in a sense that when we experience the world, I briefly mentioned it previously, when we experience the world, we are not seeing the reality as it is. We are seeing the world through our interpretations, and more specifically, we're actually seeing the world through our generalizations, our deletions, and our distortions. So generalizations, like in order to save and be more efficient in our internal memory in our brain, we create generalizations of the world. So we say, well, this always happens. So this never happens. These are generalizations. And then we have deletions. So when someone says something that we don't like, we sometimes block it out and we just kind of turn the other way, or we don't see reality as it is, or we see distortions whereby someone says, no one loves me. And then someone comes up to you and says, you know what, I really love you. And you're just like, oh, they love my shoes. And so we distort the reality. And I think that when it comes to Bitcoin, what I think is so fascinating is it's getting us to step back, and rather than look at the world through our own generalizations, deletions, and distortions, we're trying to move this stuff aside, and we're never going to fully succeed. And is it even beneficial to succeed? But it's just, we're trying to move this stuff aside to be more objective, to try and see the world more as reality as it is, in a hope that, hey, we can have more clarity, more information that can help with the prosperity of humanity, the prosperity of survival. And I think that is so fascinating.
Yeah, cleansing the doors of perception, as it were, which is also why I think there's a lot of psychonauts in Bitcoin, and why those pursuits are at least intriguing to more and more people who are seeking this type of clarity that we've both alluded to in this conversation, and also this type of meaning. Because, if you're really on that pursuit, it's kind of hard to leave a stone unturned, right? Especially such a compelling one where there's been so much written about them and so many fantastic things said about it. You're just gonna be like, no, I don't really want to look under that stone. It's like, what? If you're really, pursuing, as great a truth, as great a meaning, as great a value as you can, on this journey, you can't leave a stone like that unturned. You got to go flip that sucker over and see what's underneath. And I think it's, done properly, there's a lot to be derived, a lot of value to be derived from that stone. And so it's all, this is the whole point, right? There's such a confluence of different modalities and different forms of wisdom and different states of consciousness all coming together around this thing. Bitcoin is somehow, through us, pulling it all together. Let's let's consult the wisdom of the founding fathers. Let's consult the wisdom of the ancient Egyptians. Let's consult the wisdom of the tribes people of the Amazon. Let's consult, the wisdom of our current, scientific state of scientific inquiry and knowledge. Let's bring it all together and see if we can perform the exact same process that you were talking about with our, clarity and consciousness, but with things, quote unquote, in the exterior world. And let's see where the fat is and where we can cut that off, and what remains, what's the highest distillation, or the one that coheres the most, to orienting ourselves toward the production of an optimally meaningful and joyous life. I mean, that seems to be the whole game anyways, right? And we're consulting all these things to see how we might do that more effectively. And as far as I can tell, a lot of people in Bitcoin now are just ferociously engaging in that process. Of course, people have family and work and everything, so people are doing it to differing degrees, but there's just this insatiable curiosity. And it seems like even if you think that curiosity is toward understanding Bitcoin, what you end up finding is that as you go down that rabbit hole and attempt to understand Bitcoin, because what it is so relevant and affects and has implications in so many different areas, they end up getting pulled into your curiosity, and you have to understand them in order to understand Bitcoin. And what you ultimately get is a much broader understanding of not everything, but many things, and particularly those things of the greatest significance. And that it's impossible that doesn't have a transformative effect on you if you're doing it earnestly, genuinely, with the proper requisite humility. And that's what seems to be happening.
100%. And I think, absolutely spot on. And I think it kind of ties back to that whole compassion thing. I think we have to have compassion for people coming into the space and people that are asking questions, because we got to remember that everyone has their own journey that they've been on to end up where they are now. And having compassion allows us to, I think, be approachable and inclusive, and allow these people to ask questions that allow them to get to this higher self of truth seeking. And I think it can be easy sometimes to get frustrated with the volatility and the community and kind of the FUD and all this kind of stuff. But I think if we want Bitcoin to survive, we have to be inclusive, and we have to have compassion for those that are on their journey, just as we were on our journey where we ended up now. You know what I mean?
I know what you mean, but I think the inclusivity happens by default, because as Bitcoin brings a greater and greater variety of people in from different parts of the world with different beliefs, upbringings, perspectives, experiences, you get diversity by default. So like, I've never been a big one on the whole, like, first of all, let's get this out of the way. Bitcoiners are the nicest people I've ever met in my life. If they can sense that your pursuit of understanding is genuine, you will get nothing but support and help and everything else you need. If they sniff, exaggerated ego, if they sniff false intentions, if they sniff disingenuousness, they're going to put pressure on you so that you reveal it, so that, we can all see it. Because as we've been discussing this whole time, character is the representation of your moral development. And if the moral development and all the things that influences and leads to is really the most important thing, and I think we've kind of been making the case that it is here, then determining, assessing, bringing to light people's character is a very important part of that process. And as an imperfect person, you should want to be held up to that scrutiny, even by people who are as imperfect as you are. Because if you genuinely are here for the refinement of your character, then you want that feedback. You can choose to do with it what you will. You can ignore it if you want, although I wouldn't recommend that. What I would suggest is that you empathize with the people leveling it, you try to consider it, and then you determine for yourself if it's valid or not, and if it should upgrade or update how you see yourself or how you orient yourself in whatever way. But I think and it's also a presumption that like the come in with open arms is always the most attractive thing. I mean, there's many people out there that are, let's just say, super skeptical and, bit of a chip on their shoulder. And if they see someone being too nice and inviting, they're like, nah, I don't trust this shit. But if they see people being like, somewhat stern in their convictions, then they're attracted to that. So everyone is attracted to different methods of interacting and different ways of appealing to people. So I think the best thing to do is recognize that the bigger this gets, the surface area, the cultural surface area is going to expand, and that's going to mean that there's more. It's going to appeal to more and more of a diversity of personalities and characters anyways. And as a result of that, the best thing to do is just come in and be yourself. That's it. You know, like if you feel like being somewhat salty, or if you feel like putting someone's feet to the fire, then go for it. Recognize that you're inviting the same treatment of yourself. And if you want that, then more power to you. But again, it comes back to this thing, like, we're all still just determining how best to act in this world. What should we be striving for? How should we be acting? What's the best way to conceive of ourselves so that we're optimally, you know, so that anxiety is reduced and that joy is increased and that relationships are the relationships we want are most easily fostered. Like, and none of us have like the perfect answer to that. So we're all just interacting here and trying to figure it out. And I think that, well, I just put it this way. I'm not at all a critic of really any of the interactions that happen in this space, because it all just allows us to see more and get more data and understand and see people's true nature and character more. And I think that's a good thing. And if we put artificial, and I don't think you were necessarily suggesting this, but just to take it to a place that some people have suggested, like if we pretty much bring in like the fiat sensibilities into this world and impose artificial political correctness or taboos on ways of interacting or inviting people in, then I think we lose something far more important than what we gain in more rapid adoption or, you know, bringing people into the fray or whatever. Because I think what's really valuable here is that people are gaining access to a form of freedom that they've never had access to before. In fact, that no human being has ever had access to before. And that's allowing them to more freely explore their expression. And that exploration of their own expression and their own behavior allows them to accelerate their journey towards the behavior that they increasingly determine that they want to be, right? That person that they want to become, that behavior they want to engage in, that moral framework that they want to adopt. That freedom to express accelerates that process. And there's nothing more important than that. And so I don't want to inhibit that expression in any way.
For sure. And I think you bring up such a good point. And I think that when it comes to, if we want Bitcoin to succeed and we want Bitcoin to prosper, it's the same thing. Realistically, everyone has their own skill set and everyone has their own personality. And by bringing these different skills and these different personalities into the space, we only increase the diversity of Bitcoin. And I think that is phenomenal because it just attracts more people into the space. And I think it's kind of like when people say, oh, well, like, how do you need help? And it's just like, why don't you tell me how you can be of value? Because I think we want to use your skill set. And I think Bitcoin as the community needs such a diverse mix of people in order to help, whether it's through energy, whether it is through hydro, whether it is through creating content, whether it is through finance, whatever it may look like. And I think that staying true to your values, staying true to who you are as an individual and staying true to your skill set, I think is important for Bitcoin to succeed.
Yeah, totally agree. You mentioned the psychic story in the DMs before on Twitter. You mentioned some other, were those the experiences you were referring to, or were there other sort of interesting experiences that you've had as a result of going down the Bitcoin rabbit hole that you wanted to discuss?
You know what? I would say it's that experience. There's been a couple others that are a little more longer winded, but it's just what Bitcoin has done is and this is where I think it truly is incredible. And I think I briefly touched on this with at the very start, where we talked about, Jordan Peterson mentions that the church does serve a purpose. You may not believe in religion, you don't have to believe in a God, but what the church does is it forces people into a room once a week to think about things that are bigger than themselves. And I think Bitcoin has truly been mind-opening and expanding in a sense that it is, for me, on an individual level, it has completely changed the way that I approach the world, because I recognize that this is so much more than just us. Our world is on a path right now, and this is my personal perspective. Our world is not on a healthy path right now, and a lot of people are struggling, and a lot of people are feeling pain of a lot of the decisions that we've made that have led us up to this point. And I think what Bitcoin has done is given us a new system to opt into, which, from the information that we presently have, looks like we can create a very prosperous economy where people can, as you said earlier, they can live up to their ideals and live true to their values, which I think is only going to be more beneficial for the rest of us. And I think that is huge. And so recognizing that, it's where, like, I quit my job 2 years ago now, purely just to focus on Bitcoin and educate. And even though, yes, it's financially tough and I'm struggling, I realized that what comes around goes around, and I'm not in it for the monetary aspect. I'm in it because if we can help humanity prosper, then that's incredible for all of us. And I think that it's like an awakening for me. It's an awakening in a sense that I realize that we're all just a cog in this bigger wheel. And if we contribute, we can create and we can materialize the world that we want to live in. We just have to seek truth and stay true to our ideals.
Yeah, very well said. I couldn't agree more. And again, that behavior invokes a lot of, it's reflective of a lot of the actions, the narrative actions that we've seen in religion before, right? This kind of leap of faith. I'm going to devote myself to the thing that I see of highest value, and I'm going to have a faith that my doing that and my attempting to investigate myself for the greatest value that I can discover, and then apply it or transmute it out into the world in service of this thing as much as I can, is going to not only net perhaps some of the best good that I can contribute to, but it's also going to return to me what should be returned to me, and what I need to be returned to me, and what is good to be returned to me in a certain sense. And again, I'm being a little bit dramatic, but again, I almost not really, because what you just said has been the case with so many people that I know, like very good friends and people that I've only just met and had these types of conversations with. And it begs the question again, to my investigation of all this, it's like, you just articulated it a little bit, but I think it goes deeper, of course. It's like, what could possibly compel that sort of behavior in so many people so consistently? And everyone does it in different ways, but most people want to either work in or contribute to Bitcoin in some way once they start to get it. Now, whether they're willing to completely quit their fiat job and just figure it out in Bitcoin land, or whether they straddle the ladder and serve it until they find something in the former, everyone does it differently. But the punchline is, everybody wants to do that. Everybody wants to contribute to this thing in some way. And I mean, it's just amazing that people feel that it's such a force for good in the world and for good in their lives, that they are willing to make such a heretofore unheard of sacrifice or commitment to it, as far as their career has progressed, or they've planned their life in the past. And again, as we said at the beginning, much to be determined in this domain as to why it is people are acting that way. But I think we're on the path, and hearing your experiences and motivation certainly contributes to that, to both my understanding of that, but also the compendium of voices that's doing this thing, that just makes it more and more clear that something very unique and very special is happening here.
Mm-hmm. No, 100%. Couldn't agree more. I think there's an energy from a more spiritual kind of side of things. I think there's an energy, and it feels like we're trending in the right direction. I feel it's good, but maybe that's just completely my mind tricking me into fallacious things.
Well, I mean, this is to the point we made earlier, right? Like, you're right. We may be wrong, and it may not turn out the way you want it to now, or in 3 years from now, or 5 years from now, or ever. But I think to the point we made, and this, again, faith is intimately wrapped up in this way of orienting oneself, is, do you believe that the principles or the values that are guiding your behavior in this regard are the best ones that you can use to do so? Mm-hmm. And if you do, then you're probably going to be accepting of whatever outcome occurs. rather than doing the other one that we explored, which is playing out all the chess moves and determining like, well, this is the thing I, at least currently with my current understanding of myself and the world, think is good and desire. And I'm going to orient my behavior simply to moving toward that. And that can work sometimes. But other times I think it fails, if not in total, but when arrived at that preconceived place, it's not what one often thinks it is. And it usually causes one to behave in a way that perhaps departs from the way they want to behave, or a way that's more aligned with the values and principles that they would like to imbue their action with, which is why when you take the former approach, you've almost already won right off the bat, because the goal is aligning behavior with certain values and principles, not the outcome from doing so. And so you're already succeeding every second that you do that. And what nets as a result of that is just gravy, almost in a sense, you know. And again, I'm taking I may be a little too woo-woo here for some, but I actually think that's the truth. And I by no means have mastered that ability in my own life, because I still get fearful about certain things and not managing them. And I guess lack a certain amount of faith at times in orienting myself in that way. But I think when I kind of think about it logically and rationally, and it seems true to me. And I think part of the endeavor is to increasingly increase your capacity for acting in that way.
Mm-hmm. No, I absolutely spot on. And I think that's just where I think as long as we are truth seeking and we're trying to strive to our best ideals, I think that's all that really matters. It's kind of like, it's like a tattoo. Like, as long as, if you get a tattoo because at the time it meant something to you, and at the time it was shaping who you were as an individual, then you shouldn't regret it in life, because that was who you are in that moment. If you got it through peer pressure, if you got it through other means, then that is different. That's when you regret it, because it wasn't staying true to who you are as an individual.
Mm-hmm. Well said. Well, Seb, you got anything else you want to explore or talk about, or should we shut it down?
I think we can wrap it up, but I just want to say I truly value the content you bring to the space, and I think you've created a lot of insight and opened up the minds of so many people, and so I really value that. I think your work is phenomenal, and I really value just the time you've spent today wanting to chat.
Oh, thank you, man. I appreciate those words very much, and it's been an honor and a pleasure to speak with you as well and hash out some of these ideas, and I'm sure we'll do it again at some point in the future. So we'll keep in touch, and be well, and we'll do this again sometime.
For sure. Sounds great. Thanks a lot.
All right, brother. Take care.